Stories, Philippines podcast.
A child's voice, small and perfectly clear, could sometimes be heard on the darkest nights, not crying, not screaming, but singing. A Christmas carol, a familiar melody, maybe Silent Night or O Holy Night, sung just a little too fast, a little too high, and always from the church's bell tower after the midnight mass had ended. But there was no child in the tower. The last mass of the 9 nights of Simbang Gabi had finished. The heavy wooden doors of the centuries-old church were barred shut, the priests long gone to their small, quiet meals. Yet the song would continue, a sweet, unsettling sound floating over the hushed streets of Vigan or Taal, or any of the ancient towns where Spanish stones still held fast against the jungle's slow, creeping advance. And then, just as the final, clear note hung in the cool air, a different sound would follow. The wet, rhythmic slapping of something heavy and low dragging itself across the cobblestone, moving away from the church, its presence heavy with the smell of old incense and something metallic, like stale blood. That sound, they say, is the spiritual tally being paid. A reminder that in the Philippines, the act of profound faith can, paradoxically, be the very thing that opens the door to the most profound darkness. It is the curse of the sacred betrayal. A darkness permeates this episode, touching on scenes and themes some may find deeply unsettling. Listener discretion is a necessity. I am Paul, and you are listening to Stories Philippines podcast. The 9-day tradition of Simbang Gabi, or the Dawn Mass, is not just a Filipino custom. It is a foundational pillar of the spiritual year, a cultural act of devotion that binds families and communities. It begins 9 mornings before Christmas Day. Long before the sun cracks the horizon, people stream toward the parish church. The air is cool, heavy with the promise of day, and thick with the smell of puto bombong and bibingka sold on the street corners. It is a beautiful, deeply comforting ritual. But comfort and faith in the Filipino experience are often a thin veil. The deeper history of this 9-day ritual holds an anxiety, a profound fear that predates the arrival of the Spanish galleons and their gold-trimmed missiles. Before the 9 masses, there were older, darker cycles of appeasement. The indigenous spiritual world was not strictly divided into good and evil. It was a chaotic ecosystem, ruled by spirits and deities, the Anito and the Diwata, who demanded respect, sacrifice, and tribute. To the pre-colonial Filipino, the forest was not a resource, it was a hungry, watchful being. The harvest was not an agricultural success, it was a temporary gift from a spirit who could take it back at any moment. Balance was the key. When the Spanish friars introduced the rigid dualistic theology of heaven and hell, of Christ and Satan, they layered a new kind of spiritual anxiety onto a people already accustomed to walking a very fine line. The 9 masses, a Catholic tradition imported from Mexico, became in the Filipino consciousness a 9-day ritual of spiritual hedge. It was a way to petition the new, powerful God for a blessing, usually a fervent prayer or a profound wish, but also, perhaps unconsciously, a way to appease the lingering older forces who might resent the new devotion. Think about 1985. In a small farming town in Pangasinan, a young man named Marco was determined to complete the 9 masses, not for a new job or a better life, but for his little sister Elena, who was inexplicably sick. Elena had been vibrant, then slowly began to fade. Doctors were baffled. The local albulerio, the folk healer, spoke of a duende, a mischievous earth spirit, that had been offended and was now sucking the very light out of the child. Marco was a good Catholic. He scoffed at the albularyo superstition, but desperation has a way of dissolving certainty. He resolved to complete the 9 masses, a perfect streak, offering his 9 days of sleeplessness and devotion as a spiritual payment for his sister's life. Marco's village was nestled at the foot of an old green mountain, a place where the air was always heavy with the smell of wet earth and ancient leaves. This mountain was known to be the dwelling place of the aswang, not the singular modern film vision monster, but the collective, terrifying spirit of evil, shapeshifters, viscera suckers, and ghouls. Marco made it through the first 8 days. He rose before the first rooster crowed, walked the dusty, still dark kilometer to the church, listened to the sermon, and returned, exhausted but resolute. The blessing he sought felt palpable, growing stronger with each completed day. Elena, back at the house, would cough a little less. Her lips would hold a faint trace of pink. But then came the 9th day, the Misa de Gallo, the final Mass. The spiritual parallel here is not unique to the Philippines. The idea of a sacred bargain is ancient and worldwide. In pre-Christian European folklore, you find tales of people striking deals with figures in the woods or at crossroads, the Faustian bargain. In other Asian cultures, you have the belief that intense, focused devotion, often for a specific number of days, can grant a boon, but that devotion must be perfect. Any flaw, any moment of doubt or distraction can nullify the contract and worse, turn the spiritual power you have amassed against you. The Filipino fear is amplified by a dark history of spiritual colonization. For 300 years, the Spanish church taught that outside the walls of the church, the world was saturated with the devil's influence. The old gods, the Anito, were rebranded as demons. The beautiful, chaotic, natural world became a place of peril. This created a spiritual vulnerability. The Catholic faith was a powerful shield, but if that shield failed, if the practitioner sinned or doubted, the punishment would be doubly severe because the forces waiting outside were now understood as the eternal, relentless evil of the Christian hell. The sacred betrayal is this: the perfect act of faith, when tainted by a single critical error, does not just fail to bring a blessing, it brings a curse. Marco on the 9th day was tired. His eyes burned from lack of sleep. His mind, usually sharp, felt hazy. He was walking to the church, the air cool and biting, when he saw the light. It was a small, flickering glow from a distant, overgrown part of the mountain trail. Not on the path to the church, but away from it. A part of the trail where no one ever went. He tried to ignore it. The church bells were beginning their steady, summoning toll. He was almost there. But he heard a sound. A faint, distressed meow. A kitten, lost, alone, somewhere near that mysterious light. This is where the fear tightens its cold grip. The devil, or the aswang, rarely appears as a howling beast. It appears as a distraction, as a necessary compassionate detour. It preys on the most fundamental Filipino values: compassion and concern for the vulnerable. Marco stopped. If he went toward the light, he would be late. He would break the perfection of the 9 masses. He would forfeit his sister's life-saving blessing. But if a small, defenseless creature was suffering, how could a good Christian, a man of faith, ignore it? The psychological insight here is about moral injury. The feeling of being trapped between two terrible choices. The impossibility of maintaining moral purity in the face of brutal reality. Marco chose compassion. He left the main path, scrambling up the wet, dewy slope toward the flickering light and the faint, pathetic cries. He searched for what felt like an hour, pushing through thick bamboo clumps, the stems knocking together with a dry, unsettling clatter. He found nothing. No light, no kitten, just the dense, still darkness of the jungle and the damp, metallic smell of stagnant earth. He had been fooled. The church bells had stopped. In a panic, he raced back, arriving at the church just as the people were beginning to file out, their faces alight with the completion of their pilgrimage. He was too late. The Mass was over. The 9-day devotion was broken. He went home, his heart a cold, hard stone in his chest. Elena, his sister, was gone. Not passed away in the way a doctor understands it, but completely empty. She lay on her mat, eyes open and dull, her breathing shallow, her spirit simply absent. And that night, Marco heard the song, the small, clear voice singing a Christmas carol from the church tower, followed by the wet, heavy slap drag of something on the cobblestone moving in the direction of his house. The spirit that had been holding his sister captive, the offended duende or whatever it was, had been momentarily held back by the 8 days of Marco's faith. But the single failure, the betrayal of the sacred commitment, was the proof the demon needed. It wasn't the broken bargain that cursed him. It was the spiritual power that his devotion had amassed, now weaponized and turned against him by the forces he had tried to keep out. The folklore is rich with these tales of spiritual leakage. It speaks of the tiyanak, a baby that lures people off paths with its cries only to transform into a sharp-toothed demon. It speaks of the manananggal, often drawn to the light and solemnity of the church, waiting nearby for a soul left vulnerable by doubt or a small sin. This is why, in many parts of the Philippines, the midnight mass on Christmas Eve, the final mass, is treated with an almost nervous solemnity. People are on guard, they look around, they bring amulets or anting-anting, small tokens blessed by a priest or a folk healer, warned to ward off the evil spirits that are thought to be most active when the veil between the sacred and the profane is thinnest. It is a time when the spiritual tally is finalized, a time when blessings are granted, but also when spiritual debts are collected. In the early 1970s, during the dark days of martial law, the sacred betrayal took on a historical and political dimension. In the town of San Pablo, Laguna, a journalist named Clarissa began attending the dawn masses, not out of devotion, but as a cover. Clarissa was secretly documenting the disappearance of political dissidents, the salvaging, as it was grimly called. She used the large crowds and the low light of the pre-dawn masses to meet sources, exchange notes, and maintain a quiet, constant vigil on a military checkpoint near the church. Her faith initially was a shield. The sanctity of the church, she thought, offered protection, a spiritual immunity. One night, the 7th Mass, a man slipped her a small rolled-up piece of paper. The paper held a single name, Manuel. Clarissa knew Manuel. He was a kind, young university organizer who had vanished a week prior. The note claimed he was being held in a private, unmarked building far outside of town. Clarissa completed the Mass, her heart pounding. She knew she had to act immediately. But as she walked out, the cold reality of the situation hit her. The streets were still heavily patrolled. To leave town now would be a terrifying risk. She was tired, she was scared, and she was, fundamentally, a woman alone against a monstrous regime. She told herself, I will wait until tomorrow, I will rest, I will plan. She went home, she slept. She betrayed the urgency of the moment, the sacred plea for help contained in that small rolled paper, in favor of her own safety and rest. Next day, Clarissa was ready. She hired a tricycle driver, but just as they reached the town border, they saw a cloud of black smoke. The private building where Manuel was supposedly held was now engulfed in fire. The official story was an electrical fault. Clarissa knew better. She had waited. Her moment of self-preservation had cost a life. The fear is not always the monster with the fangs, but the profound human failure that invites the monster in, the failure of moral fortitude. The tale of Clarissa in San Pablo is a reflection of the global phenomenon of state-sanctioned terror and the church's role within it. The Catholic Church throughout history has been both a sanctuary for the oppressed and, at times, a complicit silence. In the Philippines, the sacred space of the church was supposed to be inviolable. But when the military regime could violate a political sanctuary, it suggested that even the spiritual sanctuary could be compromised. If the church cannot protect the body, can it truly protect the soul? The answer in these dark stories is that it can only protect the soul if the soul does not falter. The theological insight here is the concept of scruples, excessive guilt over small sins, turned outwards. The Filipino spiritual world takes that internal, self-inflicted guilt and gives it a physical, supernatural form. The feeling that I failed God becomes the truth that the demon knew I failed and is now here to collect. The final Mass, the Misa de Gallo, on Christmas Eve becomes less about the birth of the Savior and more about the final spiritual audit. Did you maintain your faith, your vigilance, your goodness throughout the challenge? If the answer is no, the cost is not simply a lost blessing, but an active, terrible curse. Consider the detailed geography of these locations. The old stone churches of the Philippines, like those in Pauay or Miagao, are built not just of coral and heavy limestone, but also of history and seismic fear. They are often fortified structures designed to withstand earthquakes and pirate attacks. They are essentially spiritual fortresses. When a devotee enters that space, they are stepping into a protected zone. The sound of the choir, the smell of burnt wax and incense, the weight of the thick stone walls, all of it is designed to create an immersive, sensory separation from the wild, forbidden world outside. The curse of the sacred betrayal exploits the moment of transition, the moment you leave the Mass and step back into the dark street. In the late 1990s, a family named Gomez was haunted by a similar dread in their house near Bacolod, Negros Occidente. The mother, Tessa, had a profound fear of the dark, and she believed a witch's coven met in the sugarcane fields near their property. She was meticulous about the 9 masses, forcing her 2 teenage children, Alonzo and Pia, to join her. The family was relatively poor, struggling to maintain their small sugar farm. Tessa's devotion was not for a personal wish, but a desperate prayer for protection, a prayer for the forces of the dark to simply leave their land and their lives alone. On the last night, Christmas Eve, after they had all returned from the midnight mass, Alonzo made a mistake. He had brought his new, highly treasured portable radio to the mass, sneaking it under his jacket. He had wanted to listen to the Christmas countdown music later. As they entered the house, Tessa asked him to plug it in and charge the batteries. Alonzo, tired and dizzy from the 9 days of rising before dawn, placed the radio on a small, unsteady wooden table near the open window, intending to plug it in later, and then collapsed onto his bed. The family slept. Sometime before the dawn, a storm rolled in. A flash of lightning, a sudden, brutal crack of thunder. The house shook, and the lightning, or so the story goes, struck the antenna of Alonso's radio. The radio, which was not plugged in, let out a piercing, static scream that was heard not just by the family, but by neighbors up and down the road. It wasn't just noise, it was a perfect, terrifying blend of a woman's cry and a high-pitched metallic shriek. Tessa woke up instantly, sitting bolt upright. She looked at the window. The radio was still on the table, but across the yard, silhouetted against the continuous lightning flashes, was a massive, bat-winged shadow. The mananangga, the monster with the severed torso, had been drawn by the sudden, shocking burst of sound, a sound that was an intrusion, a profane noise right after the sacred silence of the Mass. Alonzo, in his sleepy carelessness, had carried the protection of the Mass back home, but had left a breach, a device that could transmit an unholy, high-decibel invitation. That night, the family was untouched, but their fear was confirmed. The curse did not take a life, but it marked their home. The next morning, Christmas Day, the air was still and bright. But on the wet-churned earth near their house, neighbors found something unsettling. A perfectly circular patch of grass, about 10 feet in diameter, where the earth was scorched and the soil was a deep, unsettling black. Not burnt by fire, but as if something corrosive and unnatural had seeped out of the atmosphere. The science of fear helps explain this pattern. In situations of collective anxiety or trauma, the brain searches for a narrative, a pattern that explains the unexplainable. The 9 masses, being a high-pressure, high-stakes spiritual event, creates an environment where any small anomaly, a sudden noise, a lost animal, a flickering light, is immediately interpreted through the lens of supernatural retribution. The collective trauma of colonization, war, and political violence has taught Filipinos that vulnerability is the default state and that even the most sacred of defenses can be overwhelmed. The smell is often the key sensory detail in these narratives. The metallic, wet, stale blood smell that follows the midnight slab drag, the cloying sweet stench of the aswang's presence. These are deeply primitive, visceral signals of danger. The smell of a slaughterhouse, the odor of rot, the scent of something that should not be near the life and light of Christmas. This darkness, this belief in the active retaliatory curse is why the call to share stories is so vital. It's a way to keep the light on the thing that haunts us. Submit your stories to our email, storiesphpodcast@gmail.com. We are a clearinghouse for the shadows that follow the faithful. The final word on the sacred betrayal is not a theological pronouncement, but a cultural reflection. For many Filipinos, the spiritual world is not a place of quiet reflection. It is a battleground. It is a place where faith is the only defense, and the demons of sin and doubt are always present, always waiting for the moment when a man like Marco chooses compassion over commitment, or a woman like Clarissa chooses rest over action, or a boy like Alonzo lets carelessness breach the sanctuary. The 9-day Mass is the ultimate test. It is the final opportunity of the year to prove that you are not just a believer, but a vigilant one. This brings us back to the child's song in the bell tower, that single, unsettling carol after midnight Mass. It is not a Christmas ghost. It is the lullaby of the curse. It is the sound of the demon that has just collected its spiritual tally, a payment in the form of a lost life, a ruined conscience, or a permanent mark on a family home. The creature sings the song of the holiday it has just corrupted, celebrating the sacred betrayal. And the drag, the heavy, wet sound on the cobblestones, that is the sound of the demon now full, dragging its newly acquired spiritual trophy back to the shadows until the next cycle of faith begins. The only way to truly survive the 9 nights is not just through attendance, but through an unwavering, perfect vigilance. And in the face of human frailty, that is almost impossible. We have reached the end of this season, a final dark contemplation for this time of year. To all our listeners, to those who have found a small comfort in the sound of my voice on the darkest of nights, Merry Christmas. For the years we all been through the light and the shadow, thank you. Thank you for making this podcast a part of your lives, for letting us become in our own small way a household name in the stories you share. We are eternally grateful. Find show notes and support options in the description. Access exclusive content on Patreon. Follow us on social media for daily folklore facts. See us next year for another season of Stories Philippines podcast. If our purest intentions can be so easily twisted into a fatal curse, where in our lives can we ever truly find safety? The devil, I've noticed, is often in the details of the purest intention. We invite you to listen more to the deep historical and supernatural narratives of future or past episodes. Do not forget to like, subscribe, follow, and share this podcast. Support the podcast financially in ways you can find in the show notes.